Hello, hello again. Here we are on the battlefield of Gettysburg. It's Gettysburg 161. We are along the Emmitsburg Road, and we're really happy to have you with us, man. Make sure you share this with your friends, please, and subscribe to our channel. We're out here doing this in hopes that we can engage with as many people as possible. I'm Gary Edelman. That's Chris White behind the camera. We got Sarah K. Byerly with us and a special guest I'll introduce in just a second. Let me maintain his or her anonymity until we actually get there. But I want to show you our area of operations for this tour. You are looking generally south. That's the peach orchard over behind me there. As we move over in this direction, you see the Emmitsburg Road that is now behind me. This is one of the 10 roads that led into Gettysburg. As you look across the way, that's Seminary Ridge. That's the distant tree line from which McLaws's division of 4 brigades is going to come toward where we stand now. I'm looking now at the peach orchard barn, rebuilt because it was burned during the battle, and the house. And beyond that, you might see another farm. That's the Klingel, the white Klingel house. And beyond that, to the right, the actual Codori barn. And this is where we'll be operating for this video. We look forward to watching and keeping up with your comments if we can. But man, there's a lot to talk about right here. You got Mississippians, we got Pennsylvania and New Yorkers, we got some local stories, and to unfarkle some of this, to use his term, let's talk to Doug Dowds, Colonel Doug Dowds, and of course, licensed battlefield guide and more.
Well, good afternoon, gang. Welcome to Gettysburg. Thanks for joining us. Hey, let's kick this back off so that we can catch up with what's going on. We know that the Confederates come up with a new attack plan when they find Union soldiers nearly 3/4 of a mile in front of the rest of the Union line. When they come up with their new attack plan, it is to extend the Confederate battle line another mile to the south. And what they're going to launch, it's not official, but this is how it comes in execution, is an echelon attack. So in our mind's eye, picture a wave hitting a beach on an angle, or imagine dominoes falling one at a time. I know we've already talked about, we think about the first domino about 4 o'clock headed towards Devil's Den and Little Round Top. At 5 o'clock, just south of the peach orchard, finally, what's going to happen is about 6 o'clock in the evening. Longstreet has launched every one of those brigades into the attack. And by the time we get to this point, in fact, we can see Buckland's battery right there, probably most famous for the fact that that is the battery that's firing at William Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade, that as Longstreet rides up, Barksdale hits him with, "I wish you'd let me go in. I wish you'd let me go in. I'll take that battery in 5 minutes. And Longstreet has to give him the patience, General. We're all going in presently. Finally, at 6 o'clock in the evening, 1,600 Mississippians on a 300-yard front will cover that 500 yards in just under 5 minutes. They're going to slam into the peach orchard. They're also going to hit his very northern part of the line, is the 18th Mississippi, into the Sherfy house and barn. This is going to be the thunderclap at 6 o'clock in the evening that shatters Sickles' advanced position. And as he does so, what he's going to do is he's going to start to swing his brigade to the north, and we're going to follow them as they go. Now, if we talk about the Union defense, you can imagine the 63rd Pennsylvania is out there, the 5th New Jersey is out there, skirmishers, U.S. sharpshooters out there, 1st Massachusetts. We'll talk about how this line breaks down as we go. Now, one of the buildings that we're going to pass, or at least the remnants of, is the foundation of the Wentz Farm. Of course, it gives its name to it's actually the Wentz Peach Orchard. Who gives his name here. Now, his son leaves here in 1850. He's going to go south to Martinsburg, Virginia at that time. When the war comes, of course, he signs up. He's going to fight with the Taylor Artillery, Virginia Battery, and he would find himself here, though, fighting on the other side. Gary, you have more to add to this?
Yeah, maybe I do, but first let me say, good God, the enthusiasm is off the charts with this guy. That's coming from Virtual Paladin. Well done, a little Dungeons & Dragons action. We got California, we got more than 200 people on already. Thanks for joining. So, we've got the elder, John Wentz. His son, Henry, comes back and ends up fighting on the very farm where he grew up. They have a visit during the battle, and then after the battle, the son, Henry, wants to check on his dad, see if he's okay, and he will not want to wake him up after this trying experience, sees that he's okay, and he pins a tender note actually onto his coat, and he left. Now, Doug, we know that Henry, young Henry, is not the only one to leave Gettysburg to make carriages in the South. There's a much more famous one named Wesley Culp, who actually does the same thing, and he will die at Gettysburg.
Well, and we see that, we're only 8 miles north of the Maryland border. And of course, Gettysburg was known back then for its carriage making. So as we walk into the northern edge of the peach orchard, the Wentz Peach Orchard, notice all this artillery. Notice it's not facing the Confederate lines back behind us to the west, but notice these batteries are all facing to the south. And often the question is, why? Well, it makes sense when we think about it, as this Confederate attack unfolds from south to north. all the northern flanks of those advances are now exposed, and all of this artillery can fire into it.
And then you've got, of course, when the Confederates arrive from the west, suddenly that artillery's all facing the wrong way. We are along the Wheatfield Road now, and we're going to be joined again in a moment with some of our friends from the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg. Waste no more time, guys. Come on out here. We got Dane, we got Mike, and these guys always have some cool stuff going on.
So what Mike's holding is a pocket diary that was transcribed in 1865 from originally written in pencil. This is in pen though, and it was owned by Adam Howard Pickle, a member of Company G of the 68th Pennsylvania Regiment, raised out of southeastern Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Chester, and Montgomery County. He was a native though of Phoenixville, where the famed Griffin guns were manufactured. And I'll just give you a little bit of content for the day on July the 2nd here. He wrote, Thursday, July 2nd, this day we witnessed a very severe battle. About 3 o'clock, we planted our batteries in position. The brigade in supporting distance, our regiment laying right behind the batteries. The enemy succeeded in having a front and cross artillery fire on our batteries, making it a very hot place for us. I was wounded by a musket ball just above my ankle as I was coming off the field toward evening. The rebels carried me, they having driven us and held possession of the ground, into a house where I lay without any material change till Saturday afternoon. Now he would eventually make his way back to the 3rd Army Corps Hospital. He'd be held in a tent and would receive chloroform, get his leg amputated on the 10th, and then 2 days later he would die from bleeding to death. Basically, one of the 58 men of this regiment who died from wounds.
That's just terrible stuff, Dane. I mean, in other words, he's writing up until the time of his death practically. This is a Thursday, is July 2nd, 1863. He doesn't get any sort of care until Saturday, Doug.
And that's probably one of the things that kills him, right? The trauma of being out here and having been wounded, and then getting care. Perhaps at a late time, maybe the damage had already begun or the infection had already begun.
And let me just add on there real quick that this is pretty interesting. So not only is it accounts like that help us understand the Battle of Gettysburg, but accounts like that combined with the actual stuff. There's something about having the actual thing, in this case, the diary, that somehow provides a testament to what happened here.
It's almost why the battlefield becomes, I'll throw in a generic sense, a spiritual place. The object comes back to the place where the owner had it, where great things were done on our behalf, as Colonel Chamberlain would say.
Yeah, I've never known how to really explain what it's like to be on the field with something that was on the field, especially when it's testament to somebody's last moments. It's hard to know how to feel exactly.
Yeah. We're walking down the Wheatfield Road, which of course is here. Now, when we think about when Sickles moves out here, Graham's brigade would be in the peach orchard. The next Union units would be de Trobriand's men in the wheat field. Remember, this position has almost twice as long as what Sickles would have had back in the position he was assigned. So, in order to fill this gap, what he's going to do is, or one of the things that Meade will tap into, is the artillery reserve. Remember, the Army of the Potomac has an artillery reserve. 118 pieces of artillery, not assigned to any unit, but belong to the Army. In this case now, the Army gets to mass its fires, and of course it's under the general direction of Henry Hunt, actually not even arguably, he's the best artillerist in the American Civil War. When Meade comes out here and realizes what Sickles has done, and he makes 4 quick decisions, he's going to tap into the 2nd Corps to help fill the gap between the Union line, about where we see the Dome Monument and where Gary pointed out the Codori Farm, the red farm with the white spires. He's going to go ahead and bring the 5th Corps, Meade's only reserve, almost 10,000 men, to support this advanced position, because his fear is, if he asks Sickles to pull back, his fear is that while this Corps is on the move, they could be destroyed. So he's going to support this advanced position. We could make the case that one of the reasons the Army of the Potomac tends to suffer on past battlefields is that they make mistakes and then they compound those errors. Here is an effort for Meade to stop the bleeding and not compound the error. The 5th Corps comes out here, and he's also going to tap into his artillery reserve. All the batteries that we see on the Wheatfield Road, Thomas's, Hart's, Phillips, Bigelow's battery. That all comes from the artillery reserve. It's going to arrive over at the Trossel Farm at about 4 o'clock. They're going to take position and get out here by about 4:30. And now we can understand, it makes sense. This is why they're all facing to the south. They're targeting the initial part of this wave attack as it comes from south to north.
Good stuff, Doug. I just want to reply to some of these comments here. One, first of all, Nathan, yes, Culp is an important family name here in Gettysburg, and if you ever want, you can get a 72-hour tour from Tim Smith about the 28 Culps that live around here, the 85 that are in the county. Furthermore, I saw a few other people, and I'm just so happy to have so many of you all here as we go. We are facing toward the Emmitsburg Road. I don't even know what I'm doing with my mic there. We're facing toward the Emmitsburg Road. The Confederates are coming from that direction. The Round Tops, let's do a brief 360 there, Sarah, because I'm looking at big Round Top in the distance. I see little Round Top. I can barely see the cleared western face of a portion of it there. And then we're over here going toward Trossel and this Excelsior Brigade Memorial. Maybe Doug or Chris, you could set us up to talk a little bit about some of the stuff associated with the Excelsiors.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I just want to point out very quickly, the 3rd Corps is a corps that is really has an identity crisis here at Gettysburg. Coming out of the Chancellorsville campaign, they sustained the 2nd highest number of casualties coming out of Lee's greatest victory. And as they come up here, Charles Graham's brigade had sustained more than 700 casualties, the most for any one Union brigade at Chancellorsville. Here at Gettysburg, another 700 casualties. The 2nd New Hampshire, which will be very close to the point of this salient that is pointing outward for Dan Sickles' line out along the Emmitsburg Road, sustained 312 casualties at Chancellorsville, and now we're entering another battle where they're going to be in an exposed position. The brigade behind me will be the Excelsior Brigade, famously commanded by Devil Dan Sickles himself. Shout out to Jim Hessler and his great book about Dan Sickles. But the Excelsior Brigade, the 70th through 74th and the 120th New York, they went into Chancellorsville with a brigade commander named Joseph Revere. That name's going to sound very familiar to you because there's a guy in the Revolutionary War who made the Midnight Ride. That's Paul, that's Granddad. Unfortunately, Granddad was better than Grandson because Grandson marched this brigade right off of the battlefield for 8 hours during the Chancellorsville campaign against orders. And then that means he's court-martialed. We're going to bring in a Colonel, William Brewster, to be in charge here. So this chain of command that was so disrupted during the Chancellorsville campaign, this corps went from 18,000 men down to 10,000 men, 3 divisions down to 2, and now we have a new division commander, we have new brigade commanders, all of this because of the attrition of war that is going to play out here. And the Excelsior Brigade, which is one of the most famous brigades at the Battle of Gettysburg, will be broken up along this line, and we'll have the individual markers telling you along this line, along the Emmitsburg Road, about where they were stationed. But of course, one of the most famous monuments here is the firefighter beside the soldier looking out towards the west, towards where the enemy would come. And what I want to point out from this position, this is almost dead ground for us. If we're the Union soldiers, we can't see over top of that rise. We don't know that the 13th, the 17th, the 18th Mississippi is coming from this direction. We might see the 21st Benjamin Humphreys men coming in from this direction, but we are going to be hit at point blank range. This is not a reverse slope defense. This is a bad position.
Oh, good.
Yeah, go for it.
You go ahead.
All right, I was going to say, we do have some items. Come on, Sarah, over this way. Sarah has to stick close to me. It's not because we like each other. It's because I have the hotspot in here that keeps us transmitting in my backpack. So I want to turn it over to Dane from the National Civil War Museum again. He has a really unique piece for us.
So this is a photograph of George Rankin, a member of the 3rd Excelsior Regiment, or the 72nd New York. And he was a native of Jamestown, New York, in southwestern part of the state, southwestern corner. And he would receive a severe wound to the thigh, would end up dying here and being buried in the Michael Feisel Farm in the woods, and then being relocated to the Gettysburg National Cemetery. So Hankin here, George Hankin, you had the Adam Pickle diary back at the 68th New York, both bodies being moved. In the case of Pickle, he was moved back to his hometown of Phoenixville. Originally, he was only buried with his blanket here at Gettysburg, and his brother Isaac would recover the body, put it in a pine box lined with zinc to get it transported home.
Good, and I think you have something else as well.
Yeah, and I want to point out with this picture, Sarah, if we get in here, this is probably an early war photograph. We can see that this gentleman has a high collared shell coat. There's probably 7 buttons on here. Over top of it would have these shoulder straps. That doesn't mean he's an officer, he's a private. And his hat is a brand new, almost kepi. In this photograph, yes, it's black and white, this uniform almost comes out as gray in it. And if we flip this over, Mike, if you wouldn't mind flipping that over, on here it even has in handwriting his name, Company B, 72nd Regiment, New York, and killed Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 2nd, 1863. The number down here is the number for the registry in the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg.
And let me just add, first let me compliment Mike for the deft manner in which he flipped that card. You used to be a card player in Vegas or something like that. And then secondly, just this idea of knowing when a photo was taken turns it into more of a historical document. So I compliment Chris on that there. What else do we have?
We have a transcribed telegram written by General Sickles here to General Meade, in which he asks about the status and health of one of his brigade commanders, General Charles Graham. Now, Graham, of course, wounded and captured here on the 2nd. Sickles would write this telegram July the 6th, just 4 days later. It shows that he had his mind behind his soldiers, trying to find out the actual status of his officers and keep up with his experience as an Army general himself.
Doug?
I was going to say, I think that it's also reminding George Meade, hey, buddy, I'm still here in this chain of command, even though I screwed up. Can we have this back out here for a moment? Oh, yeah. I wanted to point out before Doug steps on, number one, here at 2 different points, it says 1:40 p.m. We can see it's July 6th, 1863. We can see the number of the telegram coming off of here. And by the way, many times the officers actually had to pay to use the military telegraph during the war.
And then there's also this stamp on the other side, copy from War Records.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So it becomes a really interesting snapshot. You know, if we think about Sickles, about 6:15 in the evening, he gets wounded just over there by the Trossel farm. We know that Dr. Sim will amputate his leg. He will keep his leg with him, of course. And by the 5th of July, he would be back in Washington, D.C. that day to be visited by none other than Abraham Lincoln and his son, Tad. Now, what story do we think Dan Sickles tells President Lincoln about George Gordon Meade's command? One could argue this is the beginning of the poisoning of the well between Lincoln and Meade's relationship, because the first person to the board with the markers gets to tell the story. And in this case, Sickles is the first story of the Battle of Gettysburg that President Lincoln gets to hear. Now, the idea that he writes George Gordon Meade on the 6th of July, you think that George Gordon Meade doesn't have a bunch of other things on his mind on the 6th of July? I think Chris is right. Sickles is trying to give him a little bit of, hey, I'm still here, I'm still a player, you owe me a response. And it's not that Meade doesn't care about his brigadiers or his privates for that matter. The problem he has is that, hey, Robert E. Lee has just pulled off this battlefield. I don't know whether he's going north or south. I've lost a quarter of my army. I'm trying to refeed it, and I still have my mission to stay between them and Baltimore and Washington and act as an army of operation against Robert E. Lee's army, his original directive on the day that he gets command. So Meade's got a pile of other concerns other than where is General Graham. I'm sure it is important to him, but one has to put this in the grander context of all the things on his mind. As we walk this line, and this is a pretty cool spot because this is why it's great to be out here. When we think about the original Union position, we talk about Graham's brigade here. We were just talking about the Excelsior Brigade. They would have been just to the left of the Klingel barn and just to the right of the 105th Pennsylvania there. So they would have been 2 forward, 71st, 73rd forward, 70th and 72nd behind. When the Peach Orchard collapses behind us, you can see the original position for Union troops is here. You can see that you're in defilade. Remember, this attack begins with a Confederate artillery bombardment. And the idea that we are covered and concealed on this side of the ridgeline is important. And so what they talk about is you'd have your infantry laying on this side of the road, Union artillery firing back at the Confederates. As the Confederates advance, you can imagine, even as these batteries talk about, they give them shell and case shot on the advance, and then they would disappear in a little proclivity, and we'll take a look at that. There's an intervisibility line just on the other side of the Emmitsburg Road. Then all of a sudden they lose them, and when the Confederates come out of that, then they transition to canister. You can also imagine for the infantry on this side of the ridgeline, as the Confederates advance, Now they go into position. The 114th Pennsylvania, the 57th Pennsylvania, the 105th PA, they're all going to go over the rise now because now they need clear fields of view and clear fields of fire. So when we walk the ground, we get a really good idea because the ground can speak to us about how the soldiers and the commanders are using this field to their advantage. So we can see their position initially, and then it makes all the sense in the world. Well, why did they do that? Well, the answer's staring us right in the face.
Yeah, Doug, I think those are some great points. Number one, let me touch on the fact that there's going to be a rivalry of sorts in the inner high command of the Army of the Potomac after the Battle of Gettysburg. Dan Sickles, Dan Butterfield, and some others will be against George Gordon Meade, whereas Alexander Webb, Gouverneur Kimball Warren, and others will be on the side of George Gordon Meade. And when you sit here looking at Daniel Sickles versus George Gordon Meade, we have this post-war writings and war that goes on. Remember, Dan Sickles lives all the way past the 50th reunion of this battle, but George Meade dies in the 1870s. So Sickles tells his story for many, many years. And we see this happening throughout much of history. Alexander Webb will even start throwing lies at Sickles, who's throwing lies at Meade. And some of those lies will go along with, that Sickles' leg was taken off by a drunken volunteer and not Thomas Sims, the medical director of the 3rd Army Corps. There's a lot of Civil War, as we would call it today, shade being thrown at one another. Another thing I want to mention, as Doug was pointing out very accurately, all of this area would be filled with Union soldiers. You cannot tell on the other side over there between 500, 600, and 700 yards as you move up Seminary Ridge beyond where we are right now that those guns are at point blank range for the artillery. And unlike the Union Center on July 3rd, 1863, during the pre-bombardment for Pickett's charge, there is depth to this. If the Confederates miss their targets, which are at point-blank range, along the Emmitsburg Road, anything bounding back in here will cause casualties. And many of the casualties that will be sustained back here prior to this battle will be from that bombardment. One last thing. Sickles and Meade are robbing Peter to pay Paul. This portion of the line is far overextended. Dan Sickles wanted to have a more compact line along Cemetery Ridge, but he doesn't feel that it's safe because of some blind spots and some bad terrain. So he moves forward, has to double the extent of his line with only 8,000 to 10,000 men. That means they're going to have to send men from the Union right over here to the Union left. But as the echelon attack, as Doug pointed out, starts off at Devil's Den, moves to Little Round Top, moves to the wheat field, Dan Sickles will call into this sector and start sending over George Burling's largely New Jersey brigade into that sector. So reserves are being shifted from one place to the other, and the Confederate battle plan for that afternoon, and you can debate it, was working. It's drawing troops in that sector, weakening this area, and it's going to open that opportunity finally for William Barksdale to come in here with his Mississippians and crack the shell that was the Peach Orchard line.
Excellent, great stuff, Chris. And let me just say, you're with the American Battlefield Trust. If this stuff is a little bit much, if you're not a Gettys nerd yet, make sure you go ahead and look at a map. Look at our other videos that we've done, the many from the Peach Orchard. We've done them from along near this Klingel Farm up here, and consult other things. You don't get this through 1 or 2 videos if it's confusing, okay? 2, welcome to Andy Wolf Tracks, Wolf Filet O Beer. Great to have you here, man. Thanks to Shandfaf, if I got that right, for your generosity toward us, and thanks for posting the gentleman who has an ancestor who actually died at Gettysburg in Carr's brigade. And to that end, that concerns a question I'm going to have for both Doug and Chris. You know, we're talking about the 3rd Corps with 2 divisions. You got Birney's division, and their brigades are spread out between the Peach Orchard and Devil's Den, a solid 1/3 of a mile apart. But then you've sort of got, you know, Andrew Humphrey's division, and he's basically got 1.5 brigades on the road, some of them others in the woods, and some get in the rear, and some others get parsed out, okay? But in the end, it's Birney's division that is driven back much more quickly than Humphrey's legendary slow retreat from here. So Doug or Chris, I'd love to hear what you have to say about if they had good positions or if they were smart.
Yeah, so that's great. You just tapped into your inner Andrew Humphreys, the other division commander, because we are starting to look at their line. When we talked about Brewster and the Excelsior Brigade, that's the first of Humphrey's brigades. So we talked about that there. And then we'd have Joseph Carr's brigade, basically going from the Klingel barn, the white barn, all the way to the Codori barn, the red barn with the white spires. And then as Chris brought up, there's Burling's brigade held in reserve because Andrew Humphreys is a talented commander. In fact, Charles Dana would say that he is the best soldier in the Army of the Potomac. Now on top of this, that means that he's keeping a reserve because a reserve is your hedge against the unknown. If you're broken in the defensive line, you can feed in your reserve. Oh, by the way, if you achieve success in the attack, you can feed in your reserve in order to reinforce success. Burling's brigade is back here because Humphreys has, as Gary suggests, a rather small line, but he has a reserve, and Humphreys would make the case the only reason he pulls off of the Emmitsburg Road is because he's ordered off the Emmitsburg Road. Now, the other thing that happens is, as Chris talked about, Union is robbing troops off the field. Burling's brigade largely gets pilfered to pull to other parts of the field. And Andrew Humphreys would write about this too. He calls this a ruinous practice. The idea that he had thought out a well-defended position and the idea that his reserve got pilfered when times got tough, he did not have another unit to tap into. So that reserve has largely been pulled away. In fact, arguably the only unit that's left here is the 5th New Jersey, and the only reason that they didn't get pulled out is because they're up on the skirmish line on the other side of this ridge. So Humphreys has a really great defensive position. It's pretty compact. It is high ground. And although many of his commanders are new, Humphreys is a good trainer, and although he'll only have 50 days in command of this division of the 3rd Corps, you could argue that they are largely in control even during this 400-yard retreat that they will have to make. Now the question is, why do they have to retreat? As we look back behind us, we can imagine Barksdale's brigade hits the peach orchard. They're going to wheel towards us. They're going to start attacking in this direction. Hence, when we see that line of monuments, just where that line of cars is, that's the first fallback line. And that doesn't last long, because now what happens is, you can imagine Humphreys is now trying to refuse his right. This is where many of the Excelsior regiments go. They're going to fall back, largely hinged by the 11th New Jersey at the Klingle Farm. That kind of becomes the new bend in the Union line as they fold back here. He refuses his left to take care of this threat coming from Barksdale from the south. At the same time, threat coming from the south, the next part of the echelon attack is coming. Chris mentioned about Wilcox's Alabama Brigade, followed by Lang's Brigade, and ultimately we know there's a Georgia Brigade headed this way. For all these Union soldiers that are in this position, they're facing Confederates coming at them from the west, but they also have Mississippians rolling in on them from our south. And of course, this creates the massive pressure that we see here. And when he ultimately, Humphreys that is, gets the order to pull back, it is pulling back in this direction. So they're going to fall back to the north and east, back into his other position. The other thing to keep in mind, and it's a little subtle piece that we often miss, when Humphreys takes up this position, he is allowed to tap into Caldwell's division. Caldwell's division would have been in a position at approximately where the domed monument is. The problem for Humphreys is, about the time that he's dealing with all this chaos, Caldwell's division is now in the wheat field. So he had his reserve taken, and the troops that he could have tapped into have also been removed.
And let me just throw in that I think Doug Dowds has worn himself out. You don't hear Doug breathing heavy, but we're walking fast. He's getting all worked up and whatnot. I want to say thanks to Eva and to Joseph for their generosity, and to John for his extraordinary generosity. We're so happy that you're watching, that you're supporting battlefield education and preservation is all the better. We really appreciate it. Chris?
Yeah, first off, it reminds me of Wayne's World out here right now. Sarah's behind me. Car! That scene where they're playing field hockey. Or street hockey. I wanted to touch on just a couple things Doug was talking about. I'm going to hand this over to Sarah for a moment. Thank you. We're just walking and talking here. So over in that direction, as Doug pointed out, that's John Caldwell's division, and that is roughly 4,500 men in 4 brigades, the only 4-brigaded division here for the Union Army. That is Winfield Scott Hancock's old division. They will be marched to the south. It will be broken up, but eventually find its way to the wheat field. One brigade is grabbed by one of Sickles's staff officers, who takes them off to the wheat field, and then the other 3 end up there as well. And that's a whole nother story for another time, which you can check out on one of our videos from last year. So check out our YouTube channel. But we also are going to start to see falling back from this position. Let's stop for just a second. Falling back through these fields will be Humphreys' men. And Humphreys, who is an old soldier, as Doug pointed out, and a Meade fan, who will eventually become the chief of staff of this army, he will have his men march off this field, halt, reface, fire. reload on the march, halt, reface fire, and he will have a fighting retreat. Whereas other parts of this field, we will see small knots of soldiers standing and fighting against Kershaw's South Carolinians, Barksdale's Mississippians, and others who are coming along this line. Wilcox's Alabamians, West Point graduate of the class of 1846. He seemed to be in everybody's wedding from that West Point class. He comes down, rolling down through here, and pushes towards eventually the 1st Minnesota. He will complain later on that his division commander was almost a coward and didn't come across that road, calling out Richard Heron Anderson, who goes on to become a corps commander in Lee's army in 1864. Also coming through here will be some Floridians, more Georgians under the command of Ambrose Rand's Wright. So we're seeing a flood heading in that direction of the large monument that looks like the Taj Mahal, and that is the Pennsylvania Memorial, the largest memorial on the battlefield. So what is happening here is from the Union center, men are being shifted down in that direction. From the Union right, same thing is happening. From all other parts of the field, the center of the line where those guns that Doug talked about, they're being pulled over there. So now we're seeing weak spots. Humphreys, who's upset because he had a small division. Remember, the 3rd Corps went from 3 divisions to 2 and lost 2 division commanders at Chancellorsville. He's new to command here. They don't know just how hard of a fighter this guy is. He pulls off step by step, trying to fight his way through here. And we will see William Barksdale charging down through this area, only to be felled, and I'm going to do a Tim Smith, over there by some Union soldiers and found potentially by some of the men in Carr's brigade, shout out to who's here, from the 26th Pennsylvania, though some people claim he was wounded over there, some over there, some over there. So Barksdale is wounded somewhere out in these fields mortally and will die the next day at the Hummelbaugh Farm. And I want to correct one thing that I said. The 2nd New Hampshire took the highest casualties at Chancellorsville. It was the 12th New Hampshire.
Oh man, Chris getting it all right. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. We're on the south end of the Gettysburg Battlefield, approaching the center or center. And I just want to say we're so happy to have so many of you here, including Ghost Hunter for your generosity, and of all people, Ghost of Sickles Leg, man. He said there's a whole lot of sickles going on, and he provided a little bit of help with that. And I just want to say there's somebody on here who seems to be loving the feed, whose handle is boring. So I guess we've won you over. We're glad to hear that. Before we move on a little bit further, I'm glad Chris pointed this out, because what a view. I see the Emmitsburg Road towering above us, the Klingel Farm over there. We're going to get our friends on there. That's okay. You can see the Klingel Farm. There's a couple other farms we still want to at least reference while we're here, and Chris already pointed out what's in the other direction. Real quick, because there's a whole lot of fighting going on here, not just a whole lot of sickles going on. Let's bring on our friends again, because they have one more thing. It's already an evocative piece. So what do we have?
Well, this is an example of what you don't want to do on the battlefield, and that is overload your musket. This is a split barrel of a Springfield rifled musket, likely in 1861, but the unique distinction of this barrel is there's a stamp right on the backside, NJ, for the state of New Jersey. New Jersey, of course, had several troops out. In this lower end of the battlefield, you have the 11th New Jersey Monument up by the Klingel House, and then several other New Jersey monuments on the southern end of the battlefield as well. And this was likely found in the wheat field vicinity.
Good. I think this is a gun. Chris has to have something to say.
I always have something to say about guns. So this is an 1861 Springfield barrel. One of the things that's interesting about it is it has exploded, obviously. But whenever they come out here after the battle, they are going to pick up nearly 30,000 small arms off this battlefield. Half of those have at least 2 rounds, if not more, lodged in them. The Springfield Armory had did a study to see how many rounds it would take to blow one of these things apart. To show you how powerful these, or how strong these barrels were, if you put 8 rounds into it, it'll still fire. On number 9, this is what happens.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Hey, we're walking past the Daniel Klingel farm here. When we think about Daniel Klingel, he only buys that farm, that 6-bedroom or 6-room log cabin, as many of the soldiers said it, in 1862. So when the soldiers come out here, they say, you should get out of here. And he goes, if I'm going to die in my home. And then finally he realizes, oh my gosh, somebody could really get hurt out here. And eventually he will decide to leave. You can see, if you got a keen set of eyes, some of the chinking between the logs. The soldiers will knock some of that out, that they can use that as a pretty good firing position. And again, we can use that as a kind of a marker in our mind's eye of where Humphreys bends his lines back to take care of the pressure coming from the south. And with that, why don't we keep heading
Let's
up the
keep
road?
moving. We got lots to do. We have another guest to meet as well. So here we go. You're again with the American Battlefield Trust. We're heading generally northward toward the Emmitsburg Road, but we're on Sickles Avenue right here. We're heading toward the Rogers Farm, which is one of those farms that doesn't get a lot of love because there's nothing there anymore other than sort of a marker. But fighting at that area, you know, we've got, again, that's Carr's Brigade, I believe, and the 1st Massachusetts is fighting there. Now, see our video from a couple of years ago where Chris, Doug, and I were out in that field there, really breaking down a lot of this. If you want a little bit more of that too, I think Harry Fonts covers this part of the fight just wonderfully in his Gettysburg the Second Day. John Heiser covers it in an article in Gettysburg Magazine, and of course Jim Hessler and Britt Eisenberg cover the stuff behind us really well in their Peach Orchard book as well. But Doug, you want to set up a little bit for what we're going to see up here at the Rogers House site?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about when Humphreys comes out here, we are talking about Carr's Brigade. We'll see Turnbull's battery, 3rd U.S., F and K. Interesting, not a 3rd Corps battery. Part of the artillery reserve, and oh, by the way, not part of McGilvery's artillery brigade, but another part. This is George Gordon Meade using the entire Army of the Potomac to fight this battle. He's piecemealing his army, and we know this will happen all the way to the end of the battle, where it's like a little kid at the dike, where he puts his finger in one crack and he puts his toe in the other, and he puts it all trying to keep this thing together. So these are from the artillery reserve, and Carr talks about how happy he is when they show up. You can imagine the Rogers Farm is going to anchor this position. The picket fence represents the farmstead today. Pete Rogers decides to stay. His wife, Catherine, decides to leave. But Josephine Miller, a 27-year-old woman who's there, stays with him, and she will bake bread. And this leaves a massive impression on all the soldiers who fight in and around the Rogers Farm. In fact, they remember and they will reminisce, and even when they come back for reunions, there's a great picture of the regiments that fight here with Josephine Miller literally standing next to the stove which she used to bake bread. And you think about if you're an infantryman, we talk about, you know, before you go into battle, they're going to issue 3 days rations. And imagine that for a moment. For Henry Clark, the Commissary General of the Army of the Potomac, on the 30th of June, if he issues 3-day rations to 93,000 men, that's 279,000 rations. How does that work? Where does he get them from? How does he make that happen? And if you're a good infantryman, of course, you could put that ration in your nasty backpack. Or if you're a good infantryman, you could carry them all right here, and you'd eat them all on the first day, and the second day you'd be a little bit miserable, and on the third day you'd be hungry. So you can imagine by July 2nd, these guys are super happy that there's someone as gracious as Josephine Miller who's still baking bread for them.
Good, good. Let's give a go across here. Here we go, crossing the Emmitsburg Road, going over to the side of the Rogers house.
Yeah, I just love to add that, you know, there are a number of battles here at Gettysburg. There's one on June 26th, one July 1st through 4th, or July 1st through 3rd. And then you have the battle for preservation. Then you have the battle for memory. And one of those battles out here would be in 1913 when Dan Sickles comes back out here for the 50th anniversary and makes his headquarters in this vicinity. And he will be greeted by soldiers from around the country, including Confederates and a widow named Helen Dorsch Longstreet. She will come out here and try to tell the story of James Longstreet, her husband. She's a very articulate woman and a former newspaper person who would write eloquently during the 1913 reunion, the 1922 Marine Corps exercises. And of course, she is trying to justify what James Longstreet did here. Dan Sickles is trying to justify that forward movement. And there's this battle over interpretation, especially during that 50th anniversary, that 1913 reunion. So the story of the Battle of Gettysburg does not end when these two armies leave here on July 3rd.
Good, good. So when we think about this attack now coming across the field, what we would be at right about here is the northern edge of Wilcox, Alabama brigades. So the 9th and 14th. As they come across this field, they're going to slam into position. And then the next part of the echelon attack, this would be Lang's Florida Brigade, its smallest brigade in Lee's army, the 5th, the 8th, and the 2nd, now coming across this position, and they will put pressure on here. And we can see, just like Chris talked about, as they pull Union troops to the south, they're now hitting this weakened part of the line when Humphreys is ordered to fall back, and now they will be beginning to fall back when the last bit of that domino will come, and that will be Rand's Wright's Georgians, and that'll go around the Codori barn. And that will finally hit the Union line where we see the large obelisk monument, which is the U.S. Regulars Monument here at Gettysburg. And of course, that's where they break through. What James Longstreet calls the greatest 3 hours of fighting done by any troops on any field of battle has worked. It has pulled Union soldiers to the southern end of the field. Each one of these attacks have done this part, and now Wright will break through. He'll wait for the next part of the attack to catch up, to widen that opening and deepen that opening. But of course, when they look back behind them, they don't see anybody coming. They'll send a runner back and they don't see anybody coming. And finally, without any supports on their way, at about 7:30 in the evening, those Georgians will fall back across the field, and that will end the fighting on this side of the field on July 2nd, 1863.
That's great. So many people don't know about this. They assume, why did Robert E. Lee make this crazy Pickett's Charge attack? Well, he had heard that Rand's right got across that field with 1,300 guys and only people on his right, and he said, what? It's not getting there, it's staying there. So maybe Lee, with the mountains to his back and, you know, with a reason to get across and being in enemy country and in a desperate situation, thought maybe this is the way. If we send 12,500 guys at the same time, maybe this will work, okay? One of the things that is fascinating about this, and I don't think we're walking any further than this, is that Codori, Rogers, Klingel, Sherfy, Wentz, this is fought on people's farms. I mean, we tend to obsess over this stuff and say, you know, wow, how cool it would be to have one of these farms. No. This would have been an absolute nightmare with your crops gone, with your life changed forever, sometimes with poisoning going on, with all that you've stocked up gone, Doug?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so your life would literally be catastrophically wrecked for this. You know, we talk about these fences and we point them out, but you know, until 1870, this is the largest national infrastructure expense in the United States, is building and repairing fences. The idea that they said you could start in Gettysburg and ride 25 miles in any direction and not run into a complete farmer's fence just talks about the work it would have taken to get this back in shape so that you could start growing crops. Because here in North America, you got to fence farm animals out. So everything about this is life-changing for these people, and it's quite remarkable that they come back and rebuild in spite of all this disaster. It speaks to a degree of resiliency across the nation with the loss of life and the destruction all around that they press on.
I think let's close out with one more object from the awesome National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg. They're going to have a humble-looking piece of paper, but I think it might be testament that might summarize, you know, so many experiences here.
So what we have is an inventory of effects for Frederick S. Kettle, a private in Company E of the 1st Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Kettle was a native of the state of Massachusetts. He would die from wounds received in battle in the field hospital, and you can take note of the inventory where there's listing of nothing at all. Clothing, hats, caps, all of that, all gone. Kettle died on August 2nd, 1863, a month after receiving the wounds here on July the 2nd.
I mean, and sometimes that's it, right? The glory of war that we talk about, to die at Gettysburg, maybe even under your flag, is in fact at a faraway place at a field hospital with nothing in your possession. At least he was identified, there is that. But Doug, any final reflections on this?
No, I think it is a really great point. We often think about the glory of it and the success of driving people back or accomplishing their objectives. And we talk about people dying heroic deaths under their flag. But for the majority of these people, most people aren't killed outright. Most people will be wounded, and then they will linger. And the idea that that's how their life comes to pass, you know, amongst strangers in a strange place, but all collectively committed to a common cause, that's the truly remarkable part that talks about how we are all stewards of this great experiment.
I don't think I can put it any better. Thanks so much for joining us, Doug. Thanks to Sarah Byerly. Thanks to our friends from the National Civil War Museum. Thanks to Chris White behind the camera, still working all sorts of magic. And I want to offer a public apology to our friend who we were supposed to meet along the way and who we walked under without going to visit. So we will hear from that individual again, but my apologies to you all who were watching and engaging so much with this content and generously supporting the American Battlefield Trust during, and anybody I missed. Thanks so much for all your support of battlefield preservation and education.